Case 1.
Dr. Hsiu-Ying Lisa Tseng, an osteopathic physician, seemed like the picture of medical professionalism in the quiet neighborhood of Rowland Heights, California. Running a busy clinic with her husband, Tseng's practice was marked by swift consultations and quick prescriptions. Her patients, many of whom came from distant areas, knew her as the doctor who didn't judge and was always ready to prescribe relief in a bottle. What they didn't know, however, was that Tseng's clinic was slowly turning into a deadly operation. Her practice began to raise serious red flags. There were whispers among the local medical community, complaints of overcrowded waiting rooms, and concerns over the speed at which patients were being seen. But the most disturbing aspect was the steady flow of powerful opioids and sedatives dispensed with little to no regard for proper medical procedures. It wasn't long before word spread that Tseng's practice had become a haven for those seeking prescriptions for highly addictive and sometimes lethal drugs. Behind the glossy facade of a caring physician was something much darker. Coroners and regulators began to link her prescriptions to a growing number of overdoses. In fact, 9 patients connected to Tseng's clinic died in less than 3 years. Yet, instead of heeding the warnings, Tseng continued to write prescription after prescription. Pharmacies began rejecting her scripts, and other doctors grew increasingly alarmed. Still, Tseng remained unfazed, as if she were above the consequences. The case soon escalated from mere malpractice to something far more sinister. Investigators uncovered a disturbing pattern of negligence and criminal conduct. Tseng had skipped vital steps in her examinations, failed to review patients' medical histories, and disregarded a state database meant to track doctor shopping. Even more damning, her clinic's revenue had skyrocketed, with nearly all of it coming from cash-paying patients. The profit-driven system was working perfectly, until it wasn't. Then came the unthinkable. The deaths of 3 young men, Stephen Ogle, 24, Joseph Rivero, 21, and Vu Nguyen, 28, in 2009, all after filling prescriptions written by Tseng. What made these deaths even more shocking was that none of the men lived near Rowland Heights. They had traveled long distances for their fatal prescriptions, an indication of just how far Tseng's notoriety had spread. In the aftermath, investigators found that Tseng had continued writing prescriptions for dangerous drug combinations even after being made aware of the fatalities. When federal agents executed search warrants at her clinic, they discovered altered patient records, further evidence of a practice built on deceit. The trial that followed was nothing short of explosive. In 2015, Tseng was convicted of 3 counts of second-degree murder in connection with the deaths of the 3 young men, along with nearly 24 other charges related to illegal prescribing and fraud. The prosecution argued that Tseng's actions demonstrated a shocking disregard for human life, a pattern of behavior that crossed the line from negligence to murder. She had continued her deadly practice, fully aware of the consequences, for the sake of profit. In 2016, Tseng was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving at least 30 years. Her case was groundbreaking, not only because it marked the first time a physician was convicted of murder for prescribing fatal doses of drugs, but because it exposed the dangerous intersection between greed, negligence, and the prescription drug epidemic that was ravaging communities across the nation. Tseng's conviction sent shockwaves through the medical community, raising difficult questions about the responsibility of healthcare professionals in preventing addiction and overdose deaths. The case was later upheld on appeal in 2018, with the courts emphasizing that Tseng's conduct showed a complete disregard for the lives of her patients. She had knowingly put them in harm's way for the sake of money. Her case became a chilling reminder of how the medical profession, once seen as a beacon of trust, could be corrupted by greed and indifference. It served as a stark warning: no one, not even a doctor, is above the law. And in the end, justice prevailed, with Tseng receiving a sentence befitting the magnitude of her crimes. For the families of the victims, justice meant more than a conviction. It was about accountability. Tseng's actions had cut short the lives of young men with bright futures, and for them, it was clear. What happened was not just malpractice, it was murder. The victims, their families, and the community all deserved better. And the law sent a clear message with Tseng's life sentence. Doctors who abuse their power for profit will be held responsible.
Case 2. Amy Bishop, a 44-year-old Harvard-educated geneticist and neurobiologist, had once been on track for a promising career in academia. But in February 2010, her life took a devastating turn at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Bishop, who had once presented herself as a driven researcher, a respected faculty member, and a mother of 4, was about to shatter all the images she had carefully cultivated. Bishop's academic career had been marred by frustration and conflict, particularly after she was denied tenure in 2009. The denial was a blow she could not recover from. Her professional world, once full of promise, now appeared to be crumbling. The stress of the situation built up, and her mounting grievances boiled over. A history of erratic behavior, interpersonal disputes, and personal struggles added to the fire. For months, Bishop had been vocal about feeling unjustly treated, accusing the university of discrimination, and her behavior was becoming more erratic. Earlier incidents in Bishop's past had gone largely unnoticed. In 1986, she had shot and killed her younger brother, a death initially ruled an accident by authorities. Years later, she and her husband had been questioned in connection with a mail bomb investigation, but were never charged. These incidents, though seemingly separate, began to form a disturbing picture of a woman whose life had been punctuated by violence and crisis. Then, on February 12, 2010, Bishop walked into a routine biology department meeting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Seated at a conference table, her colleagues had no reason to suspect the horror about to unfold. Without warning, Bishop drew a 9mm handgun and opened fire on the professors seated around her. 3 people were killed: Department Chair Gopi Padilla, Professor Maria Ragland Davis, and Professor Adriel Johnson. 3 others were wounded but survived. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving the room in chaos and terror. Witnesses reported a frantic scramble as they tried to disarm Bishop and prevent her from fleeing the scene. Bishop was arrested shortly afterward. In police custody, her disjointed statements revealed her anger and frustration over her career struggles. Investigators quickly linked the shooting to her tenure denial, and the case moved rapidly through the criminal justice system. Bishop was charged with capital murder and attempted murder. The fact that a woman, an academic, had turned a department meeting into a scene of mass violence shocked the nation. In Alabama, capital cases require a jury to hear evidence, even if the defendant pleads guilty. However, the families of the victims, hoping to avoid a prolonged trial, requested that the death penalty not be pursued. In September 2012, Bishop pleaded guilty to capital murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the pressures of academia and the potential consequences of professional setbacks. Bishop's life had been filled with warning signs, but it wasn't until the moment of violence that they were fully recognized. Even the tragic shooting of her brother, though once deemed an accident, was revisited in light of her later actions. While Massachusetts authorities did consider reopening the investigation into her brother's death, they ultimately declined, citing the ongoing Alabama conviction. Amy Bishop's case serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of unresolved grievances and unchecked mental health issues. It also raises important questions about the systems that failed to address her increasingly unstable behavior and the devastating toll it took on the lives of her colleagues and their families. The legacy of her crime will forever be marked by the lives lost in an academic setting that, once a place of promise, became a deadly crime scene.
Case 3. Dr. Debora Green, a 44-year-old board-certified emergency physician, once embodied the image of professional success in the Kansas City area. A respected doctor and mother of 3, she lived in Prairie Village, where her life seemed perfect to the outside world. Married to cardiologist Michael Farrar, the couple had it all: a large home in a quiet, upscale cul-de-sac, children involved in school activities, and 2 thriving careers. But beneath this picture of suburban bliss, their marriage was beginning to unravel. By the summer before the fire, Debora and Michael's relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. The couple had separated, and Farrar had filed for divorce. As their personal strife escalated, it began to overshadow the facade of a perfect life they had once shared. Friends and colleagues had always described Green as brilliant and driven, but in those months leading up to the tragedy, her behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. Michael's new relationship and the bitter divorce proceedings became the catalysts for an emotional breakdown. Debora's struggles included heavy drinking, violent mood swings, and volatile arguments, especially over custody and financial disputes. Those close to her recalled troubling incidents, such as when she called Michael, claiming she was wandering aimlessly through the city, hoping someone would harm her. Other moments were just as chilling, like when she hid in the house to make him worry. This wasn't just a failing marriage, it was a descent into something far more sinister. But the darkest turn came when Michael fell gravely ill. Doctors were baffled by his sudden and debilitating symptoms, unaware that Debora had been poisoning him with ricin, a deadly toxin extracted from castor beans. As the couple's marriage fractured, so did the bonds of family, and the dangerous path Debora had begun to tread seemed irreversible. Then, in the dead of night in late October, the Green family's seemingly idyllic home went up in flames. Debora and her 10-year-old daughter Kate miraculously escaped, but the fire took the lives of her 2 other children, 13-year-old Timothy and 6-year-old Kelly. The fire spread quickly, and despite heroic efforts from firefighters, it proved catastrophic. The community was left reeling, but Debora claimed the fire was a tragic accident. However, as the investigation unfolded, the truth began to unravel. Fire experts discovered that the blaze had not been an accident. It had been deliberately set. Investigators found multiple points of origin, and patterns consistent with accelerants indicated the fire was intentional. In fact, traces of the same accelerants were found in areas leading directly to the children's bedrooms. Further digging revealed that Debora had checked out books on intrafamilial homicide, and a novel found in her bedroom revolved around children dying in a deliberately set fire. The evidence stacked against her became undeniable. And as medical tests confirmed that her husband had been poisoned by ricin, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. This wasn't just a woman struggling with a broken marriage. This was a calculated, cold-blooded act of revenge. In late November, Debora Green was arrested and charged with the unthinkable. 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of her children, 2 counts of attempted murder for poisoning her husband, and 1 count of aggravated arson. The charges were staggering, and her bail was set at a staggering $3 million. The case would soon captivate the nation as investigators and prosecutors pieced together a horrifying portrait of a woman whose personal turmoil led her down a path of destruction. As the case progressed, it became clear that the state would seek the death penalty. But in a surprising turn of events, Debora Green entered a no-contest plea, acknowledging that the state could present substantial evidence of her guilt, but refusing to admit to the full intent of her actions. In May 1996, she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 40 years. Debora would later attempt to withdraw her plea, citing evolving fire science and her mental health struggles during the trial, but each appeal was denied. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the court remained firm in its conviction. Even as her legal team fought her sentence, the horror of her actions could never be undone. This case serves as a chilling reminder that outward appearances, no matter how polished, can hide a terrifying reality. Debora Green was once seen as a successful physician, a loving mother, and a wife with a perfect life. But behind the facade lay a woman who, driven by anger, revenge, and a profound sense of control, took the lives of her own children and attempted to poison her husband. Debora Green's story is one of a mind unraveling under pressure, but it also shows the devastating consequences when that unraveling turns into calculated violence. The justice system ensured that she would face the consequences of her actions, and the community would forever be haunted by the loss of 2 innocent children, a family torn apart, and the unsettling question of how such a horrific crime could happen behind closed doors.
Case 4. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. In the quiet, seemingly peaceful suburbs of Ontario, Canada, an unimaginable horror unfolded under the very roofs where elderly patients should have been safe. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, a nurse working in long-term care facilities, became one of Canada's most notorious serial killers, claiming the lives of 8 vulnerable patients between 2007 and 2016. What makes this case particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of the crimes, but the environment in which they occurred. Hospitals and nursing homes, places where trust is paramount, and the people responsible for caring for the sick are expected to heal, not harm. Wettlaufer's reign of terror remained hidden for nearly a decade, allowing her to slip through the cracks of the healthcare system. It wasn't until she herself confessed during a psychiatric evaluation that the true extent of her actions came to light. But how did this nurse, who was supposed to save lives, become a cold-blooded killer? Elizabeth Wettlaufer, a registered nurse, worked in various long-term care homes across Ontario. She was well liked by her colleagues, a hard-working, seemingly compassionate woman. But as with many serial killers, what was seen on the outside was far from the truth. There were no signs of violence or abnormal behavior that would have raised alarm bells. She blended in perfectly with the rest of the healthcare professionals, but beneath that facade, a darker side was quietly taking shape. The first victim and the beginning of her killing spree was 75-year-old James Silcox, who died in 2007. At the time, no one suspected that his death was anything more than the result of natural causes. But Wettlaufer, driven by a compulsion she herself could not fully understand, would go on to murder 7 more elderly patients over the next 9 years. All of her victims were under her care, and they were all killed in a chillingly calculated manner, with insulin overdoses. Insulin is a hormone used to control blood sugar in diabetic patients. When administered in large doses to a non-diabetic patient, it can cause hypoglycemia, a condition where blood sugar levels drop dangerously low. Symptoms include confusion, seizures, coma, and in extreme cases, death. What makes these murders so insidious is that insulin is a routine part of many patients' care. The dosage and administration are often left to the nurse's discretion, which meant that Wettlaufer had the power to decide who lived and who died. The deaths were spaced out over years, and the cause of death for many of the victims was initially attributed to natural causes or complications related to old age. It wasn't until 2016 that suspicion began to grow, and for the first time, the pattern of deaths started to emerge. Wettlaufer was employed at the Crescent Care nursing home in Woodstock when she finally broke down. During a psychiatric evaluation, she confessed to killing at least 8 patients. She admitted to using insulin to murder her victims, but her reasoning was chillingly ambiguous. She described feeling compelled to do it and said she enjoyed the control it gave her over life and death. But her confession didn't stop there. Wettlaufer revealed that she had attempted to kill even more patients, but their lives had been spared by mere coincidence. She said that she felt empowered each time a patient died, and admitted that it gave her a sense of relief. Her words echoed with the same detachment and coldness often found in the confessions of serial killers. But the question remained, why did she do it? What drove a nurse to become a murderer? To understand the answer, we must look deeper into Wettlaufer's troubled past. Born in 1967 in Ontario, she grew up in a seemingly ordinary household. However, her life was marked by early signs of instability. She struggled with mental health issues, including depression and anxiety, and had a history of self-harm. She also had a history of failed relationships and trouble maintaining personal connections. But it wasn't until her time working as a nurse that the darker side of her personality emerged. The power she had over the lives of her patients, their complete dependence on her for survival, appeared to have triggered a sense of control and gratification that would later manifest in violent ways. In the weeks following her confession, an investigation was launched, and authorities discovered that Wettlaufer had used her position to kill without detection for nearly a decade. It was revealed that her employers had failed to notice any irregularities in her behavior or care practices. None of her colleagues had reported her, and no system was in place to monitor the number of deaths in her care. It was a systemic failure that allowed this nurse to continue her killing spree for so long. Wettlaufer's case also brought to light the issue of oversight in long-term care homes. Many of the victims were elderly and in poor health, and their deaths were often dismissed as part of the natural course of aging. There were no red flags, no alarms raised, and no suspicion about the nurse who administered their care. It was a perfect storm of neglect, both by the institutions charged with caring for these patients and by a society that often overlooks the elderly. After confessing to the murders, Wettlaufer was arrested and charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. She was later convicted in 2017 and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case shocked Canada, leaving a nation grappling with the horror of a trusted healthcare professional turning into a killer. For the families of the victims, the realization that their loved ones had died at the hands of a nurse, someone who was supposed to be their protector, was unfathomable. But even more chilling was the thought that Wettlaufer's motives were not fueled by a deep, irrational hatred or a desire for personal gain. Instead, her killings appeared to stem from a need for control, a compulsion that allowed her to take the lives of those in her care without remorse. In the quiet corridors of nursing homes, a predator lurked under the guise of a caregiver, and her true nature went unnoticed until it was too late. Wettlaufer's case is a chilling reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in institutions where the elderly are placed, relying on others for their care. It's a stark example of how the power to control life and death, if left unchecked, can lead to unspeakable tragedy. Today, Elizabeth Wettlaufer is remembered not as a healer, but as one of Canada's most disturbing serial killers. Her legacy forever tied to the innocent lives she took and the trust she betrayed. The horror of her case still lingers, not just in the minds of those affected, but in the systems of care that failed to protect those who needed it most. And as society continues to grapple with this dark chapter in healthcare history, the chilling question remains: how many others are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when they, too, can take control?
Case 5. Michelle Catherine Thier, a seemingly successful 33-year-old clinical psychologist from Fayetteville, North Carolina, was married to Air Force Captain Frank Marty Thier. On the outside, the couple appeared to lead an enviable life, well respected in the military community, with Michelle building a therapy practice. However, beneath the polished veneer, their marriage was plagued by tension and prolonged separations. The strain between them only grew, especially with Michelle working in private practice while Marty faced frequent, demanding military assignments. They had married young, once high school sweethearts, but cracks in their relationship began to show. Their personal struggles were well documented in Michelle's counseling sessions, where frustration and emotional disconnection between the couple surfaced. Those close to Michelle noticed that her composed exterior often hid the turbulence brewing at home. Over time, as Marty's absences continued, Michelle sought solace elsewhere. She began an affair with Army Staff Sergeant John Diamond, and as the affair grew, so did the wedge between Michelle and Marty. Despite attempts at marital counseling and a brief separation, Michelle continued her relationship with Diamond. She assured her employer she would end the affair, but instead, she orchestrated an even deeper web of lies. While her marriage appeared to be on the mend, Michelle's continued contact with Diamond suggested otherwise. This wasn't a woman trying to save her marriage. This was a woman trapped in a web of deceit, balancing two incompatible worlds. The fatal night was December 17, 2000. After attending a holiday dinner, Michelle and Marty returned to Fayetteville. Michelle claimed she needed to stop by her office to pick up a reference book, leaving Marty waiting outside near the stairwell. In those critical moments, Michelle placed a call to Diamond. Investigators would later argue that this was no coincidence.
As Michelle entered the office, Marty was ambushed and shot 5 times in a swift, brutal attack that left him with no chance of survival. Michelle's version of the events quickly unraveled. She claimed to have heard the shots and rushed outside to find her husband lying on the ground. In a panic, she claimed she went to a nearby video store to call for help because she had locked herself out of the office. However, investigators were suspicious. Phone records revealed Michelle's call to Diamond just before the shooting, and military investigators connected Diamond to a gun that matched the murder weapon. Diamond was soon arrested, charged with obstructing justice after falsely reporting the handgun as stolen. Later, he would be convicted of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life without parole. As the civilian investigation expanded, Michelle became the focus of scrutiny. Detectives uncovered a detailed trail of evidence that pointed to premeditation, not panic. Her phone call to Diamond, continued communication despite the supposed reconciliation with Marty, and other incriminating behaviors painted a dark picture. When a grand jury indicted Michelle in 2002, she fled. U.S. Marshals tracked her down months later in South Florida, where she'd changed her appearance with cosmetic surgery and assumed false identities. At trial, prosecutors built a compelling case against Michelle. They presented evidence of her marriage's collapse, the intensity of her affair, and her calculated actions in the days leading up to Marty's murder. The pieces came together, showing that Michelle had orchestrated Marty's death with chilling precision. She had lured him to a predictable location, worked with Diamond to carry out the attack, and then fled when the authorities closed in. In December 2004, after a lengthy trial, Michelle was convicted of first-degree murder by aiding and abetting and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 13 years for the conspiracy charge. The psychological profile of Michelle Thier, as revealed in court documents, was not one of a victim or a bystander, but of a highly intelligent, ambitious woman who allowed personal vendettas and resentments to dictate her actions. Expert testimony highlighted the toxic mix of marital tension and the leverage Michelle gained through her affair, which ultimately led to the murder. Her desire for control, her growing resentment toward Marty, and her calculated escape from an unhappy marriage without losing her status or freedom were seen as clear motives. Diamond, though convicted of his role as the triggerman, did not diminish Michelle's central involvement in the crime. Prosecutors attributed to her the strategic manipulation of key moments: her phone call, the luring of her husband to the scene, and the flight after the indictment. The case was a stark reminder that beneath a well-crafted exterior, there can lie a deadly, calculating mind. This case stands as a chilling example of how carefully hidden desires, resentment, and manipulation can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Michelle's ability to hide behind a facade of professional and composure made her an even more dangerous individual. The law in this case did not merely punish a woman for a crime of passion. It sentenced her for a cold, calculated plot that led to the brutal murder of her husband, a man loved by his family and friends, and a tragic reminder of the destructive power of deceit.